we gather to celebrate Epiphany Sunday. We celebrate the three wise men who were led by a sign, by a star, to make their pilgrimage of faith. They travel from Persia in the east all the way to Bethlehem in the west. They were guided by that star, that wonderful sign, that symbol of God's love and God's presence. Hearing our first reading this morning, I was reminded of the incredible mirth that us theological students shared when we would hear this reading from Isaiah. Isaiah in our first reading talks about signs as well, doesn't he? Signs of God's blessing, signs of God's bounty. Isaiah writes, "Then you shall be radiant," this is a sign. "Your heart shall thrill and rejoice," another sign. "The abundance of the sea shall be brought to you," another sign. "And the wealth of the nations will come to you," another sign. "And a multitude of camels shall cover you." That's the bit that made us laugh. As a sign of God's blessing to be covered by a multitude of camels. I thought it was funny. So yes, Epiphany Sunday, we gathered together today to remember and celebrate the story of the three wise men who followed that bright star in the east all the way to Bethlehem in the west. This is the story. But today I would ask you to consider, did it really happen this way? Did it really happen as it's described in history, in Scripture? At some point, did a star really guide three wise men, three ancient mystics, three followers of Zoroaster, three Gnostics, on their journey of faith? Or is this really just a beautifully crafted story, a metaphor for faith? A story about our pilgrimage of faith, our journey, intended to offer guidance and inspiration. Did it really happen, or is it a metaphor? Obviously, I have my own beliefs, my own understanding, but today I thought I'd play with this a bit and talk about both viewpoints and leave the conclusions to you. This will be fun, for me at least. Firstly, I think it's true to say that some have argued that this was a historical event, that it did happen. It's been argued many times that there was some sort of astrological sign or phenomena that may have led the Magi. And you may be surprised to hear that recorded sightings of Halley's Comet, for example, date all the way back to the 3rd century in Europe and China. But the dates don't match. Halley's Comet visits every 77 years, the closest visit falling around 12 BC. So it's too early. It wasn't Halley's Comet. A couple of years ago, I remember reading an article by an astronomer, Michael Molnar, who writes for Australian Sky and Telescope. And he argues that the Star of Bethlehem may well have been the morning star, which is in fact the planet Jupiter, rising 12 degrees ahead of the sun as part of the constellation Aries in April. And rising ahead of the sun, he argued that the morning star accounts for Matthew's description of the star rising in the east. And there were evidently a number of Roman-era astrologers who spoke of a royal star that would appear in the sky to herald the birth of royalty. And Molnar quotes one of those astrologers who spoke of the birth of an especially divine and immortal person who is exalted in Aries, accompanied by the planets Saturn and Jupiter, with the moon moving towards Jupiter. That's rather specific. And according to Molnar, the particular alignment of these planets matches exactly the conditions of the 17th of April in the year 6 BC. Modern day theologians date the birth of Jesus to between 6 and 4 BC. So yes, I guess some have argued that there was a sign, there was a phenomena that led those 3 wise men to the birthplace of Jesus. My dad would be pleased. His birthday is the 17th of April as well. But there is another possibility. There is another possibility. There is a lot of evidence pointing to the possibility that Matthew's star was a metaphor for faith, very carefully crafted. A story about our pilgrimage of faith, written to inspire and guide the faithful. Matthew was a Jewish Christian. He was also a student of Judaism, and he knew the stories of his people. And it can't be overlooked that there are some undeniable similarities between the Herod of Matthew's Gospel and Pharaoh described in the book of Exodus. Some remarkable similarities between these 2 characters. Herod searched for the baby Jesus and kills the male children of Bethlehem. Pharaoh searches for the baby Moses and kills the male children of the Israelites. Some have said even that Moses and Jesus shared the same calling, both appointed by God, both called to lead the people out of slavery. And the similarities continue. The father of Jesus, of course, is Joseph. But Joseph shares his name with another Joseph. Joseph, the son of Jacob, one of 12 brothers representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And both Josephs are called to make a pilgrimage into Egypt in their dreams to fulfill God's will. So there's some connection there as well. And then we have the story of the Magi who travelled to Bethlehem from Persia, the story of these 3 wise men. Actually very similar to the story of Balaam, who was also a Magi, called to make a journey of faith from the east into the west, guided by a bright new star that he'd seen rising out of Jacob. Isn't that interesting? In the book of Numbers, we're told that the king Balak of Moab was frightened. He was afraid of the Israelites who were being led by Moses out of Egypt. And he called his Magi, Balaam, to go and curse Israel, but he didn't. He made the journey instead to speak of Israel's future greatness. Balaam travelled with 2 assistants. So I guess you could say there were 3 wise men who made that journey. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it? The book of Numbers talks about a pilgrimage made by 3 wise men sent by a wicked king to curse the people, but instead they make the journey to bless Israel. And all the while they're led by a star. Very similar. So I guess today each of us must choose the explanation that seems to fit our understanding. Some may well want to affirm that there was some sort of event, a sign that led those wise men to Bethlehem. And some may well argue that Matthew's star is a symbol of his faith and his Jewish heritage. A faith that we make our own. A faith that's often honoured by the pagans of the world and dishonoured by the so-called faithful. As I said at the beginning, I'll leave it to you to choose the explanation that works best for you. Because in the end, it doesn't really matter very much. Because both explanations affirm the power of the star. The power of the star as a sign of God's love and the hope that we carry in our hearts as we follow, as we make our journey of faith. Both explanations affirm that the star points to the birthplace of Jesus, and we are invited to participate. And surely, beyond all debate, beyond all the speculation, today we are united by our common recognition of the signs that lead us forward as we too search for God. A God who comes to us, a God wrapped in human flesh, a God that we see in the faces of those around us, a God that we see in the opportunities for service and growth now and in this coming year. This is the wisdom and the inspiration and the hope that moves us and shapes us. So in the words of our reading, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were filled with joy. May we too be filled with joy as we begin this new year. May we too be filled with the wisdom of the Magi, inspired and filled with hope as we make our pilgrimage of faith. The Lord be with you. Jean Bond gave me a lovely plate of her homemade Florentines this morning. Another plate, and that is, for me, a sign that my diet won't be beginning today. Thank you for that. Oh, don't ask. Let us now pray for the world and for the church and thank God for God's goodness.